What if your entire hometown was built on a lie, and your blood was the key to something ancient waiting beneath it? In The Shepherd of Tenebrous Hollow, Robert Mercer returns to his eerie birthplace, only to discover his family was marked for a dark purpose. As long-forgotten rituals resurface and horrifying rules are broken, Robert finds himself hunted by faceless creatures and an ancient entity known only as the Shepherd. The deeper he digs, the closer he comes to the truth that some legacies aren't inherited, they're claimed. I shouldn't have come. The thought struck me again as the car wound its way through the endless forest roads, deeper into Vermont's forgotten wilderness. The sun was still up, but the dense canopy above swallowed most of the light, leaving streaks of gold that barely kissed the asphalt. I glanced at the printed map resting on my lap, a government issue outdated and torn at the edges. The town I was heading to wasn't on it. No mention of Tenebrous Hollow, not even as a ghost town or an abandoned district, just a blank patch of green wilderness where it was supposed to be. And yet, here I was. The man driving George Klein hadn't said much since we left the main highway 2 hours ago. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale, eyes flickering toward the rearview mirror every so often, as if expecting something to follow. "You're sure this place exists?" I finally asked, trying to break the silence. My voice sounded thin inside the car. George didn't look at me. "It exists." His tone was dry, as if every word was a weight. "Just not the way you think." A few moments of silence passed before he added, softer this time, "If the sky turns dark during the day, don't go outside." I almost laughed. "What?" He looked at me then, briefly. And that look froze whatever chuckle had been forming in my throat. "I mean it." The gravity in his voice was unsettling. The lines on his face, the dark hollows beneath his eyes. This wasn't some old-town superstition. I nodded, half to appease him, half out of genuine discomfort. "All right." We drove for another 30 minutes before the first signs of civilization appeared, if you could call it that. A weathered wooden sign read, "Welcome to Tenebrous Hollow." The paint was chipped. A faint carving beneath the letters, old and nearly worn away, suggested it had once read something else entirely. We entered a narrow main street that couldn't have spanned more than 5 buildings. Dusty windows, boarded-up shops, houses with curtains drawn tightly shut, like the residents themselves wanted nothing to do with daylight. A single cat, gray and thin, watched our car roll by with unblinking eyes. George pulled the car in front of a narrow 2-story boarding house. "You'll be staying here." The building leaned slightly to the right as if exhausted from standing for so many years. "Where's the sheriff?" I asked. George nodded down the street. "You'll meet you once you settle in." He helped me unload my bags, one duffel, a small suitcase, and my medical kit, before heading toward the power box beside the house. With a few mechanical clacks, the dim porch light flickered on, buzzing faintly. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and old wood. The floorboards creaked underfoot. A moth circled the lone ceiling bulb in the main hallway. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen. George handed me a worn brass key. "You're the only guest." "That doesn't surprise me." I tried to joke, but my voice came out hollow. The room assigned to me was small, a single bed with an old patchwork quilt, a wooden dresser with a cracked mirror, and a nightstand with a yellowed lamp. There was a piece of paper on the nightstand. Handwritten, the edges slightly burned. "House rules: do not open the windows after sundown. Keep all lights on at all times during the night. If the sky darkens before dusk, lock the doors and stay inside. Don't answer the door after midnight." My fingers lingered on the paper, the ink smudged as if written in haste or desperation. "They take the rules pretty seriously here," I said aloud, mostly to fill the silence. George didn't smile. "They're not suggestions." Before I could press him further, a knock at the door interrupted us. Standing on the porch was Sheriff Bill Riley. Tall, broad-shouldered, with thinning gray hair and a weathered face that carried a permanent weight. "Robert Mercer?" "Yes, sir." I stepped forward and shook his calloused hand. His grip was firm but not unfriendly. Glad you made it." His eyes scanned my face briefly, as if searching for something. "Let's get you briefed. Time isn't always on our side." We walked together down the street, passing shuttered windows and empty sidewalks. Even under the afternoon sun, the town felt starved of life. "You're probably wondering why you were called in," Riley began. "I was told there were some unusual deaths." "Unusual is putting it mildly," he said with a grim chuckle. "You'll see soon enough." We arrived at the county coroner's office, a building that looked more like a converted tool shed than an official facility. Inside, the air turned colder, heavy with the distinct stench of antiseptic and something metallic underneath, the unmistakable whisper of dried blood. A body lay on a steel gurney, covered by a sheet. Riley pulled it back with clinical detachment. "Patrick Lawrence, mid-30s. The file said heart failure, but even a first glance told me that was a lie. The man's chest cavity had been neatly sliced open, except there was nothing inside. No organs, no blood pooling, just hollow, as if scooped clean from the inside out." My stomach tightened. Riley watched my reaction carefully. "Any thoughts?" I swallowed hard. "Where are his organs?" He exhaled through his nose. "If I had that answer, Robert, you wouldn't be here." Before I could respond, a loud crack echoed from somewhere outside, like distant thunder. Though the sky remained clear, Riley's face darkened. "We should finish this quick." I glanced down at Patrick's empty shell one more time, suppressing the rising dread gnawing at the back of my mind. Something was very wrong in Tenebrous Hollow, and I had a sinking feeling I was already too far in to turn back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Patrick's hollowed corpse kept replaying behind my closed eyes. Every time I drifted near sleep, the cavity in his chest would open wider, as if inviting me to crawl inside and see where his insides had gone. The creaking of the old boarding house didn't help. Every groan of the walls, every soft knock of the wind against the window pane felt deliberate, as though the house itself was breathing in the dark. I glanced over at the small clock on the nightstand. 2:57 a.m. Almost instinctively, my eyes drifted toward the window, despite the rules written in shaky penmanship that I had read earlier. The curtains were drawn tight, but beyond them I sensed a pressure building. The air felt heavy, thicker somehow. The light from the single lamp flickered momentarily, and I sat up straight, every muscle tensing. The air grew colder, as if something unseen had slipped into the room. My breath steamed lightly in front of me. A soft creaking from the hallway snapped my attention toward the door. Footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. They stopped directly outside my room. I held my breath. The knock came exactly at 3:33, 3 slow raps, spaced out with unnerving precision. I stared at the door, heart hammering, feeling the weight of the rules staring back at me. Do not answer the door after midnight. The knocks came again, this time louder. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. Whoever or whatever was on the other side was patient. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It simply waited. The old floorboards creaked again, but this time the sound wasn't from outside. It came from the ceiling, from above me. Slowly, carefully, I swung my legs off the bed, my bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. The moment I moved, the knocking stopped. Complete silence swallowed the room like a wave. For several minutes I sat there in the dark, muscles tight, listening. And then, the faintest whisper. "Robert." It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the old, cracked mirror above the dresser. I refused to look. The light flickered again, more violently this time, and I lunged for my duffel bag, where I kept a small flashlight. Its beam cut through the dim, but not entirely, to the corners of the room, writhing like living things. The air thickened further, as if the entire house was pressing inward. I had to leave the room. My hand reached for the doorknob, ice cold to the touch. With a slow twist, I opened the door to an empty hallway lit only by the distant glow of a single flickering bulb. No sign of footsteps, no sign of whoever had knocked. But faintly, far down the corridor, I heard it again, a soft shuffle. "George?" I whispered, though I doubted he'd be awake. No response. I crept down the hallway, the old boards beneath my feet creaking louder than I wanted. Every step felt like a scream. At the far end was a door I hadn't noticed earlier, likely the attic. Its wooden surface was weathered, the doorknob rusted with age. On the wood, carved deep by a blade or a knife, were 4 letters, "Keep." And beneath it, smaller, barely legible, "It's still hungry." I stepped back instinctively. The air near the door was colder still, almost suffocating. The flashlight dimmed briefly before sputtering back to full power. A sudden loud bang from behind startled me. The front door downstairs had slammed shut, though no wind had come through. I turned and hurried back toward my room, my skin crawling. When I reached the safety of my doorframe, my heart dropped. The paper with the house rules was gone. The nightstand was bare, as though it had never been there to begin with. The knock came again. This time, from inside the room. I froze, feeling the heat drain from my face. The knock was soft, almost polite. 3 gentle taps from inside the wardrobe against the back panel. My mouth went dry. I wanted to run, but my legs betrayed me. I simply stood there, gripping the flashlight until my knuckles whitened. A breath, not mine, soft and wet, from behind the wardrobe door. I wasn't alone. The lamp flickered violently once more before plunging the room into complete darkness, leaving only the thin, quivering beam of my flashlight. And then, the whisper again. "Robert, we've been waiting." The voice was familiar, a voice I had heard long ago, a voice that didn't belong here, not in this town, not in this lifetime. It was my father's voice. But my father had been dead for over 20 years. I staggered back toward the door, fumbling for the handle, ripping it open and stumbling into the hallway again. The bulb above me burst in a small explosion of glass and sparks. Everything went dark. A faint glow came from the stairs below. Sheriff Riley stood at the bottom, staring up at me, flashlight in hand, eyes narrowed. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I couldn't find my voice. I simply nodded. "We should talk." His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed the same fear twisting inside me. "Now." As I descended the creaking staircase, the oppressive feeling clung to my back. The house sighed around us like something breathing through the walls. Riley opened the front door and motioned for me to step outside into the cool pre-dawn air. "You saw nothing," he said quietly, "but you heard enough." He lit a cigarette with a shaky hand. "This place," he continued, exhaling smoke into the pale morning light, "it's not like anywhere else. You'll need to understand the rules if you want to stay alive." I looked back at the house behind me. Every window was now wide open, and from the second-story window of my room, the cracked mirror reflected the first hint of sunlight. But in the glass, I could swear I saw someone else standing there, watching us both. The town was already awake when I stepped out with Sheriff Riley that morning, or at least it pretended to be. A handful of figures moved about the streets, most of them older, gaunt, with faces that carried the hollow fatigue I'd begun to associate with Tenebrous Hollow. Their eyes darted away when they noticed me, as if even acknowledging my presence might invite some unspoken consequence. The mist clung to the cracked pavement as the sun strained through the heavy clouds. It felt like daylight was always fighting to stay alive here. Riley led me toward the sheriff's station, its sagging frame casting a crooked shadow over the empty road. The old American flag outside barely moved in the still air. Inside, the building smelled of dust and old paper. The overhead lights flickered weakly. On the far wall, a bulletin board displayed dozens of faded missing person flyers, their corners curled and brittle, names and faces, dating back decades. Some of the photos were so old they had turned sepia. I recognized none of them, except one, Patrick Lawrence. His was the most recent addition, thumbtacked hastily at the edge of the board. A younger version of the hollow corpse I had examined yesterday stared back at me, smiling awkwardly at some distant photographer. "We don't take them down anymore," Riley said softly behind me. "Doesn't seem right." I glanced at him. "How many?" His jaw tightened. 24 as of this morning, including Patrick. 24 missing? My voice rose slightly. In a town this size, and nobody's done anything? Riley exhaled sharply and rubbed his temple. "We've tried. You think anyone outside cares? The state files get closed, FBI loses the paperwork. No one listens after a while. Eventually they stop asking questions." He turned and walked me toward the back office. "But that's why you're here, Robert. You're not from here. You might still see things for what they are." I wasn't so sure anymore. After last night, I wasn't seeing anything clearly. Inside his office, the blinds were drawn, casting narrow lines of pale light across a cluttered desk. Riley handed me a file, much thinner than I expected, considering the gravity of what we were dealing with. "The autopsy reports are incomplete," he said, almost apologetically. "Every time we try to document things properly, something goes wrong. The data gets corrupted. The photos come out blank." I flipped through the folder. Grainy black and white prints, barely legible notes, medical diagrams that amounted to question marks. And then I saw it. A copy of Patrick's internal scan, a full-body CT. It showed nothing inside. No heart, no lungs, no organs at all. Just a shell. It looked surgically perfect, as if something had removed everything inside him without breaking skin or bone. "How?" I whispered, unable to form the question fully. Riley's voice dropped lower. "We think it's feeding." I froze. Feeding on what? He hesitated, as if saying the words aloud might summon something. On people, their essence, like it takes them apart from the inside, leaves behind a copy to fool the eye for a little while. A cold sweat prickled my neck. My stomach tightened with nausea. "Have you seen it happen?" I asked. His jaw flexed, and for a long moment I thought he wouldn't answer. "Only once," he finally said. "A long time ago." Before I could press further, the office phone rang sharply, slicing through the suffocating air. Riley picked up. "Sheriff's office." His face shifted as he listened, his eyes narrowing. "When?" He shot a glance at me. "Where exactly?" "I'll be there right away." He hung up and grabbed his hat. "That was George. You'd better come with me." We drove along the narrow back roads toward the edge of town. The trees pressed in close here, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The clouds above darkened unnaturally as we approached. George waited by the roadside, flashlight in hand, despite it still being daylight, or what passed for daylight in Tenebrous Hollow. "This way," he said, his voice tight. "It's happening again." We followed him into the dense woods. The underbrush was thick and damp, birds were absent, and even the wind refused to follow us into that part of the forest. After a few hundred yards, we reached a small clearing where a single figure stood, swaying gently. It was a woman, or something wearing the shape of one. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, and her mouth hung open slightly. But what froze me was her chest, or rather, what wasn't there. Her torso was hollow, concave where organs should have been, the skin drawn tightly like vacuum-sealed plastic. "She's still alive," George whispered. The woman's head turned toward us as if reacting to his voice, but her eyes didn't truly see. A wet sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a moan. Riley muttered under his breath, pulling me back slightly. "This is how it begins, Robert, before they fully empty." The sky above flickered darker again, like an unseen hand dimming the sun. Suddenly, the woman's body spasmed violently. Her hollow chest cavity rippled, as if something was crawling beneath her skin. Her mouth opened wider than seemed possible, and a low, guttural voice seeped out. Not hers. "Stay inside. Don't look. Don't call them." And then she collapsed. Her empty skin crumpled like a deflated sack, folding in on itself. Nothing remained inside but a few strands of fibrous tissue, twitching slightly before falling still. George crossed himself silently. Riley's face paled, but he didn't move. "This isn't the first today," George said quietly, "and it won't be the last." I stared at the hollow corpse on the ground, my own breath shallow. "What the hell is doing this?" I demanded. Neither of them answered right away. But it was Riley who finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There are rules here for a reason, Robert, and you're about to learn why." The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a faint whisper from deeper within the woods. Words I couldn't make out, but they were calling. The whispers followed us as we left the clearing, though no voices should have carried through the dense woods. I glanced back one last time at the empty skin lying in the grass. The shell of the woman who, moments ago, still breathed. The way her body deflated didn't feel like death. It felt like surrender. We hiked back in silence until the trees finally gave way to the edge of town. George was the first to break the uneasy quiet. "It's spreading faster." Riley's jaw tightened. "I know." I stopped walking. "What is it spreading from? What's causing this?" The sheriff didn't meet my gaze. "Not yet," he said. "Not here." There was something behind his eyes, not just fear, but... We reached the sheriff's station once more. The sky remained overcast, but darker now, like dusk approaching several hours too soon. Inside, Riley locked the front door behind us. The air inside the building felt heavier, denser. George pulled down the shades and turned on every available light, a paranoid ritual, but one I found myself grateful for. "We're running out of time, Bill," George said in a low voice, eyes darting nervously toward the covered windows. Riley rubbed his face, then motioned me toward his office. "Robert, sit. You deserve some answers." I sat across from him as he opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder stamped with several redacted government seals. "This shouldn't even exist," Riley said, "but somehow it always survives." The folder was labeled Tenebrous Hollow, Unresolved Disappearances. The earliest date read April 1974. Page after page of names filled the file. Dozens of missing persons, some listed as presumed dead, others as simply vanished. Several victims were never officially declared dead because no bodies were recovered, only remains. "I thought Patrick was one of the first," I said. Riley shook his head. "He was just the most recent. The town's been feeding it for decades." "Feeding what?" My voice sharpened. George answered from the corner, his voice dry. "The hollow itself, the thing beneath it." The way he said it made my stomach twist. "You need to understand something about Tenebrous Hollow," Riley said quietly. "It's not just a town. It's sitting on something ancient, something that doesn't belong here. People once thought it was cursed land. The old settlers avoided it. The natives warned us, but no one listened. "What is it? Some kind of parasite?" I asked, trying to ground this in science, even as my skin crawled. "Not exactly," George said. "It doesn't simply consume flesh. It unthreads people, pulls them apart from the inside, leaves copies, empty shells until even those collapse." "And the rules?" I asked. "The paper I found in my room?" "They're not old wives' tales, Robert," Riley said. "They're survival instructions." I thought of the knock last night, the whisper. My father's voice, calling my name from the cracked mirror. "Why me?" I whispered, barely aware I'd spoken aloud. Neither of them answered. Suddenly, a crackle burst from the radio behind Riley's desk, the local police band. Static bled through before a panicked voice broke in. "Sheriff! Sheriff Riley! We've got another one!" "The Simmons boy! God, he's gone! I can't find the rest!" The signal dissolved into harsh static. Riley sprang from his chair. "That was James. He's near the old quarry." George was already moving toward the door. I followed, my heart pounding as we hurried into the thickening twilight. The drive was fast, dangerously so, the winding forest roads blurred by under the flashing headlights. Shadows seemed to lean in from the woods, twisting unnaturally as we passed. As we approached the quarry, we saw James's patrol car, hazard lights blinking wildly in the distance. He stumbled out of the car as we skidded to a stop, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "They're gone," he shouted. "They just disappeared." "Calm down, James," Riley ordered, gripping his shoulders. "What happened?" James trembled violently. I saw it. I saw them. I heard them whispering. They were calling my name." His voice broke into sobs. George exchanged a grim look with Riley. "It's getting stronger," George said under his breath. "Farther out than before." Riley helped James into the back of the cruiser. "We need to move fast." A low rumble shivered through the ground beneath us. The air turned thicker, humid, like something breathing into our faces. I looked out toward the woods and saw movement between the trees, dozens of dark figures. At first glance, they looked human, silhouettes shaped like men and women, but they moved strangely, jerking in uneven steps, heads cocking unnaturally as they watched us. One of them stepped forward into the edge of the headlights. Its face was wrong. There were no eyes, only smooth, stretched skin pulled tight where features should have been. Its mouth hung open, wide and black, but no breath came out. "Back in the car," Riley shouted. As we slammed the doors shut, the figures crept forward like puppets on invisible strings. George flicked on the high beams, and for a brief moment the light pushed them back. They recoiled, twitching like insects caught in flame. "Drive!" I yelled. Riley gunned the engine. We sped off, wheels kicking gravel behind us as the creatures melted back into the dark. The farther we drove, the more I felt that dread clinging to me, not from the creatures, but from the knowledge that they weren't hunting us. They were hurting us, driving us towards something far worse. Morning never truly arrived in Tenebrous Hollow. The sky held its usual dull shade of gray, neither dawn nor dusk, as if time itself was trapped in permanent indecision. When I stepped out of the sheriff's station, the air tasted metallic, heavy with something I couldn't name. Last night's encounter at the quarry haunted me, those faceless things moving through the woods, their bodies contorting like broken marionettes. But it wasn't just them that unnerved me. It was their purpose, the way they didn't attack us directly, but instead watched, waited, like shepherds guiding stray livestock. I hadn't slept. I doubted Riley or George had either. We gathered again in Riley's office. The sheriff's eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly as he poured black coffee into chipped ceramic mugs. George leaned against the window, arms crossed, constantly glancing out at the street like something might appear any second. "I've been thinking about the rules," I said, breaking the silence. "They aren't about stopping it. They're about containing it, aren't they?" Riley nodded, his expression grim. "Exactly. Containment," I repeated softly. "But what's being contained, and for how long?" Riley didn't answer. Instead, he handed me another file, thinner than the last but somehow heavier in its implication. Inside were faded photos from 1974, black and white, slightly warped with time. A search party, armed with old flashlights and rifles, standing at the edge of the dense woods. Men, women, even children, their faces stiff with dread. At the back of one photo stood a much younger version of Riley himself. "You were there," I whispered. He exhaled. "I was a deputy back then, barely 22. George spoke up from the window. "That was the first time it tried to break through." The sheriff continued. "There was a boy missing. We thought it was just another lost hiker, but we were wrong, so very wrong." He pulled out another photo, this one of the woods themselves, and in the center, barely distinguishable but unmistakable once you saw it, was the silhouette of something unnatural. A tall, black column. No texture, no detail, just a void, standing where nothing should have existed. "We found it that day," Riley said, "or maybe it let us find it." I stared at the photo, my skin crawling. The pillar. The same name whispered in the recordings. "It wasn't moving at first," George added. "Not like now. Back then it was dormant, hungry. but patient. And you left it? I asked, incredulous. You didn't destroy it? We tried. Riley's voice broke slightly. We brought in state police, federal agents, scientists, but none of them stayed long. Files disappeared, people resigned, or vanished. He paused, voice dropping to almost a whisper. The town was advised to keep silent. It became our burden to bear. I felt my stomach churn as the weight of it sank in. This wasn't just some backwater mystery. This was systemic, generational. The lights above us flickered. All three of us froze. A low, droning hum vibrated through the air, almost imperceptible but growing stronger by the second. George cursed under his breath. It's awake again. Suddenly, the police radio crackled alive. Another panicked voice. Not James this time, but a woman. It's Sheriff. It's Mrs. Beckett. They're outside, standing in the yard. They're just standing there. The transmission cut out with a sharp burst of static. Without a word, we bolted for the door. Riley's cruiser sped through the town streets, its siren silent but its lights flashing desperately against the creeping gloom that thickened around us. The closer we got to the Beckett residence, the darker the sky grew. Though it was barely past noon when we arrived, Mrs. Beckett stood frozen on her front porch, clutching a small child tightly to her chest. Tears streaked her face. They've been there since morning, she cried, voice cracking. They won't move. I turned my gaze to the edge of her property. At least a dozen of them stood there, the faceless ones, silent, still, as if waiting for permission to cross an invisible boundary. Riley stepped forward carefully, speaking softly to the woman. Go inside, keep the doors locked, all the lights on. She nodded shakily, retreating into the house with her child. George whispered beside me, They're testing the boundaries. I stared at the figures. Their bodies twitched occasionally, but they didn't advance. They won't cross the thresholds while the lights hold, Riley muttered. But the moment one bulb dies, his words hung in the air like a guillotine. A loud pop sounded from behind us. The street lamp flickered violently before exploding in a shower of sparks. The figures twitched in response, leaning forward slightly, almost eager. We have to reinforce the perimeter, George said urgently, before nightfall. As we moved to distribute additional floodlights and portable generators from the trunk, I couldn't help but feel like every second was borrowed time. This wasn't a random attack. This was coordinated, controlled. The pillar was no longer content to wait in the woods. It was calling its children home. The last of the floodlights flickered on as dusk thickened unnaturally around us. We worked quickly, placing portable generators at every corner of Mrs. Beckett's property, their rhythmic hums barely masking the quiet dread that saturated the air. The faceless things remained just beyond the edge of the light, swaying in their odd, twitching motions. Dozens of them now. Every time I caught one in the beam of my flashlight, it would pull back slightly, like a spider recoiling from flame, only to lean forward again once I shifted away. They're testing us, George whispered beside me. No, Riley corrected grimly, scanning the horizon. They're waiting for nightfall. As if summoned by his words, the last remnants of sunlight vanished, though it was barely 6. The sky above twisted into a dense, colorless void. No moon, no stars, just absence. I swallowed hard. How much longer do we think the lights will hold? George glanced at his watch. If nothing fails, maybe 6 hours. That's a big if. Inside the house, Mrs. Beckett and her child huddled near the fireplace. Every lamp and fixture blazed at full power, creating a dome of fragile safety against the night that pressed against every window pane. I couldn't shake the feeling that all of this was ritualistic, like a game that had been played many times before, and the town simply learned how to delay losing. What happens when they finally cross? I asked quietly. Riley's face was tight. They don't just kill, they consume. What they leave behind, you've seen. The image of Patrick's hollowed body flashed again in my mind, and I instinctively clenched my fists. How many more families are still holding out like this? I asked. Less every year, George replied. Most just disappear before the rules can save them. The wind howled suddenly, a sharp whistle against the old wooden frames of the house. Then came the scratching, light at first, like branches dragging across glass. But there were no trees that close. From the corner of my eye, I saw them press closer, fingertips grazing the outer walls, pale heads tilting unnaturally as if sniffing the air. Mrs. Beckett let out a soft sob behind us. "They want inside," she whispered. "They always do," George said. And then the power dipped. The floodlights flickered. For a heartbeat, complete darkness rushed in, and with it came a sound I will never forget. Like dozens of wet mouths breathing together. When the generators kicked back, 2 of the faceless ones were gone from the perimeter. Riley cursed. "They're inside the barrier now." Before anyone could react, the bulb in the hallway exploded with a loud pop, plunging half the house into shadow. "Get the girl upstairs," George barked. Mrs. Beckett clutched her daughter and rushed toward the staircase. Riley and George followed to cover them, while I scanned the shadows near the broken bulb with my flash. That's when I saw it. One of them was inside already, standing at the far end of the hallway, partially obscured by the broken shadows. Its blank, featureless head twitched violently, as if disoriented by the patchwork of light and dark. It took a step forward, then froze when my beam hit its chest. The skin rippled unnaturally, like fluid under thin rubber, and then it spoke. Or rather, something spoke through it. "Robert?" The voice was my father's again, cold, flat, detached. "You're not supposed to be here." I stood frozen, my pulse pounding so loud it drowned out my breath. "Get back!" George shouted, pulling me backward just as the thing lunged forward into the beam, screaming in a warbled, inhuman cry. Its body convulsed as the light scorched its flesh, wisps of smoke rising from its rubbery skin. It shrieked like boiling metal, stumbling backward into the shadows where it disappeared. Riley slammed the hallway door shut, locking it behind him. "They're mimicking voices now," George said, his face pale. "That's new." I couldn't stop shaking. It knew my name. It knew my father's voice." "They've always known," Riley said, voice low. "But they never spoke before. Something's changing." Upstairs, we found Mrs. Beckett and her daughter safely locked in the master bedroom. Every lamp blazed at full brightness, casting sharp beams against the corners. "We stay here until dawn," Riley commanded. "If the lights hold, we might survive the night." We sat in silence for hours, listening to the scratching and tapping against the windows, the occasional groan of wood under pressure, and the faintest whispers bleeding through the glass. At some point, I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, filled with flashes of that hollow pillar standing in the woods, its long tendrils reaching out toward me like ropes, pulling from inside my chest. When I woke, the first rays of pale dawn were finally breaking through. The scratching had stopped. The whispers had faded. The faceless things were gone. For now. Riley exhaled, his breath shaky. "We'll reinforce the barriers today, but this won't hold forever." George looked toward me with something between guilt and warning. "You're going to need to know everything, Robert," he said, "because they're not just hunting the town." His voice lowered. "They're hunting you." The next morning, the town looked deceptively peaceful. But Tenebrous Hollow always lied that way. People walked quietly along the cracked sidewalks, heads lowered, exchanging glances filled more with resignation than fear. The sunlight barely penetrated the gray sky. It hung low, heavy like a lid pressing down on the town's collective breath. I hadn't spoken since we left the Beckett house. Neither had Riley or George. The unspoken truth settled between us like fog. The rules were failing. The entity, whatever it was no longer content staying outside. "They're evolving," George finally said, breaking the silence. "They've never mimicked voices before." "They never had to," Riley added bitterly. "Until now, the rules kept most of them at bay." I turned to him, the weight of everything crashing down at once. "You said I needed to know everything." Riley's face hardened. He exchanged a long glance with George, who nodded slowly. "Come with us," Riley said. "It's time." We drove out of town, down an old county road that snaked through the dense pines. The deeper we went, the darker it grew, like the trees themselves leaned closer to whisper their own secrets. After about 10 minutes, Riley stopped the car in front of an old, rotting church that looked like it hadn't seen a service in decades. Its steeple leaned precariously to one side, and ivy had consumed most of the wooden siding. The sign out front was barely legible. Midtown Evangelical Church. Your father brought you here once, didn't he? George asked quietly. I stared at the building, a wave of forgotten memories rising like bile. I don't remember. You wouldn't, Riley said. You were 5. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges screeching in protest. Inside, the air was cold, filled with dust and rot. The pews were coated in thick layers of grime. Cobwebs stretched between the rafters. At the far end, behind the pulpit, was a narrow wooden staircase leading downward. The true church was never above ground. We descended into the basement. The deeper we went, the colder it grew, and the faint scent of mold gave way to something sharper, coppery, like old blood. The chamber at the bottom was larger than I expected. Candles sat in a circle of stone pillars, long since burned out. Symbols were etched into the walls, crude, old, but purposeful. This was the original congregation, Riley whispered. They didn't worship God here. I turned slowly, taking in the strange carvings. Circles within circles, spiral patterns, human figures kneeling before a towering black shape. The same shape I'd seen in those old photographs. The pillar. Who were they? I asked. The founders of Tenebrous Hollow, George answered. They believed the darkness could be bargained with, fed, controlled. They called it the shepherd, Riley added, because it culled the weak and spared the obedient. My skin crawled. They made deals? Riley nodded. Generations ago, the first settlers learned something. Ancients slept beneath these woods. Instead of fleeing, they struck a bargain. Sacrifices in exchange for protection? George stepped closer to the central altar, a crude stone slab stained dark. For decades, they brought it offerings, people no one would miss, the poor, the drifters, even their own children. I swallowed hard, nausea rising. But eventually, Riley continued, it wanted more, and when the founders tried to stop, it didn't. And my father? I asked softly, though part of me already knew. Riley's eyes softened. Your father tried to expose them. He found out what was really happening here, George added. He wasn't the first to try, but unlike the others, he almost succeeded. I clenched my fists. And that's why he died. They didn't kill him, Robert, Riley said, voice breaking slightly. The Hollow did, or rather, what controls it. Suddenly, the air shifted. A low groan rumbled through the stone, as if the earth itself exhaled beneath us. The candles, long extinguished, flickered to life for a brief moment. The hairs on my neck stood up. George's face went pale. We should go. As we ascended the steps, I caught one final glimpse at the carvings. One symbol in particular chilled me. A circle surrounding a small human figure, with thin black lines stretching from its chest into the void. I didn't need Riley or George to explain. It was me. When we emerged back into the pale daylight, the clouds above the church swirled unnaturally, as if something massive turned beneath them. You were marked, Robert, Riley said softly, even as a child. Why me? My voice cracked. I never asked for this. Because your father tried to break the cycle, George said, and the Hollow doesn't forget. A low hum buzzed faintly in the air again, like distant electricity. It was growing stronger. The wind carried a faint metallic scent as we drove back toward town, the kind of smell that clings to your tongue like blood. Riley gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles pale beneath his weathered skin. George sat silently in the back seat, his eyes darting constantly to the shadows outside the windows. The rules aren't enough anymore, Riley finally said. They were never enough, George muttered under his breath. Not once it truly awakened. I stared out at the passing trees, each one looking darker, thinner, as though something had drained the life from them. You said my father almost stopped it, I said. How? Riley exhaled sharply. He found records, Robert. Records no one was supposed to see. What records? The original pact, George answered. The founders documented everything. The sacrifices, the rituals, even the names of those chosen to feed the shepherd. The name sent a chill up my spine again. They kept ledgers? I asked in disbelief. They were meticulous. George's voice was bitter. Even in evil, order was sacred. But where are those records now? They vanished the night your father died, Riley said, his voice low. Or rather, they were taken. By who? Neither answered right away. The only sound was the low hum that had followed us since leaving the church, vibrating faintly beneath our feet like a distant engine. Finally, George spoke. The council. I turned sharply. The council? What council? The last remnants of the original congregation, Riley said grimly. The ones who still believe the pact can be maintained, the ones who believe feeding the shepherd is a necessary evil. They still exist? I whispered. They never left, Robert. George's voice was cold. They live among us. They always have. As we approached the sheriff's station, Riley slowed the car, his eyes narrowing. Parked in front of the station was a black sedan. Sleek, spotless, too new for this town. Two men stood outside, both dressed in identical dark suits. One of them lit a cigarette, exhaling lazily into the gray sky. The other watched us approach, his pale face emotionless beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They know you're here now, Riley said. That changes everything. As we exited the car, the man with the cigarette stepped forward, extending a gloved hand. Sheriff Riley, he said smoothly. And you must be Mr. Mercer. I stiffened at hearing my name. Who are you? I asked. The man smiled thinly. Merely concerned citizens, Mr. Mercer. We oversee the welfare of Tenebrous Hollow. The council, George said under his breath. The man didn't deny it. The shepherd's balance has been disturbed, he continued calmly. Your arrival, while unfortunate, can still be managed. Managed? My voice rose. People are dying. Sacrifices are always tragic, he replied, unblinking, but they ensure the whole survives. I felt my stomach twist. You're still feeding it. The man's smile widened, almost kindly. The hollow demands what the hollow demands. Better to contain it than to unleash it fully. Riley stepped forward. You think this is containment? You're losing control. The rules aren't working anymore. We're adapting, the man replied simply, and we will continue to adapt, with or without your cooperation. His eyes shifted to me. You should leave, Mr. Mercer, before this place claims you too. Is that a threat? I asked. A mercy, he said, still smiling. We've already lost your father to stubbornness. Don't follow him. At that, both men turned and walked back toward their car, disappearing inside as silently as they'd arrived. George let out a long breath. We should have burned this whole town down 50 years ago. I turned to Riley. What do we do? Riley looked older than I'd ever seen him. We break the pact, he said, once and for all. And how the hell do we do that? I demanded. The ledger still exists, George said, the original one. Your father hid it before they killed him. My pulse quickened. Where? Riley's voice was barely a whisper. In the woods, near the heart of the hollow. Near the pillar? Yes. I glanced at the gray sky above, feeling the air thicken again, that hum vibrating deeper now. Then we'd better move fast. George nodded grimly. Because if we don't, they won't need sacrifices anymore. He looked toward the distant tree line, where the forest loomed like a living thing. The shepherd will come for everyone. We left the town behind just as the clouds began to churn above the treetops. The old service road we followed hadn't been used in years, barely recognizable now under the overgrowth and gnarled roots that clawed at the tires. It was as though the forest itself tried to pull us back, resisting every inch we moved closer to the center of the hollow. Riley drove in silence, jaw locked tight, eyes never leaving the thinning strip of dirt ahead. George sat in the passenger's seat, gripping his shotgun across his lap in the back. I clutched the map, hand drawn, faded. One of the last things my father had hidden away before they found him. The markings were cryptic. Old property lines, forgotten trails, and finally a single circled X. Deeper into the woods than I'd ever imagined the town extended. "It's right near the pillar, isn't it?" I asked. George gave a grim nod. "Closer than I'd like." The humming had grown louder as we drove, no longer faint but a low, physical vibration that settled into my bones. I could feel it in my teeth and my skull, like the forest itself was alive, humming its ancient song. "Once we find the ledger, we destroy it," Riley said, his voice rough. "No more rules, no more bargaining." "And what if destroying it only makes things worse?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. The sun, if it could still be called that, barely pierced through the dense canopy above us. The light had taken on that sickly gray-green tint again, like we were submerged underwater. Finally, Riley slowed to a stop near the edge of a steep ravine. "We walk from here." The three of us climbed out of the vehicle, the weight of the moment pressing down like the thick air around us. Every step forward felt heavier, like walking through invisible mud. As we hiked deeper into the trees, the sounds of civilization fell away completely. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of insects. Just that vibrating hum that had now become almost melodic. "Listen," George whispered. "Can you hear it?" I strained my ears. Beneath the hum, beneath the dull ache in my skull, there were whispers. Not words, not language, just impressions, pleading, crying, begging. "It's the others," Riley said softly, "the ones it already took." The path narrowed ahead, forcing a single file between thick, ancient trunks. Strange growths clung to the bark, black tendrils that pulsed slightly, almost breathing with the rhythm of the hume. "They weren't here before," George muttered. "This is new." "It's waking up," Riley added. "Fully this time." Suddenly, the trail opened into a clearing unlike anything I could have prepared for. The pillars stood at its center, towering, monolithic, a single column of impossible black, like a hole punched straight into the sky. Its surface didn't reflect light, it consumed it, warping everything around it. The air rippled near its base like heat off asphalt, though no warmth came from it. Around its base, hundreds of those faceless creatures knelt in concentric rings, their featureless heads bowed, bodies twitching in silent, unnatural reverence. They pulsed in unison as if breathing together with the pillar. "Oh my God," I whispered. George clutched my arm, pulling me back behind a large fallen tree. "They don't see us," he whispered. "Not yet." Farther beyond the rings of worshippers sat a stone altar, cracked but unmistakably man-made, and resting upon it, a wooden chest, bound in iron. "The ledger," Riley breathed. Every instinct in my body screamed not to move forward, but we had no choice. "We go," Riley ordered. "Fast. Quiet." We crept through the undergrowth, each step careful not to snap any branches underfoot. The humming grew louder, nearly unbearable now, vibrating inside my chest like a second heartbeat. The closer we got, the more I could see details in the faceless ones. Thin lines running down their necks, pulsating like exposed veins. Their skin stretching unnaturally over too thin bone. They weren't statues. They were alive, waiting. When we reached the altar, George immediately began working the iron clasps on the chest. His hands shook, but his focus never wavered. "Almost there," he muttered. Then, a click. The final latch popped loose. George slowly lifted the lid, revealing stacks of old, yellowed parchment, carefully bound together with brittled twine. The air smelled of mildew, ink, and something far older, the original pact. Names, rituals, dates. I recognized some surnames. Families still living in Tenebrous Hollow. Some were neighbors, others were part of the council, But then my breath caught, near the bottom, my family's name. Mercer, I whispered. Beside it, a single marking, designated bloodline vessel. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I was never supposed to survive, was I? George's expression was filled with a grief I hadn't seen before. You were meant for it, Robert, from birth. Suddenly the humming shifted, no longer steady, but rising sharply, in alarm rather than a chant. The creatures twitched, heads snapping up in unison. They had noticed. Time's up, Riley barked. Burn it, now. George pulled a flask of lighter fluid from his coat, dousing the fragile papers. Riley flicked his lighter, tossing the flame onto the soaked pages. The fire roared instantly, consuming decades of horror in seconds. The creatures screamed. No voices, only guttural shrieks that vibrated my bones. The pillar pulsed violently, as if convulsing in pain. The ground beneath us trembled. It's angry, George shouted. Run! We sprinted into the trees as the ground cracked behind us, roots tearing upward, black tendrils lashing wildly. The humming had become a full-throated roar, but somewhere in that unholy scream, I swore I heard my father's voice, calling my name. The forest collapsed behind us like a living thing unraveling. Black tendrils whipped through the air, splitting trees like matchsticks. The creatures screamed in that awful chorus, their featureless heads snapping toward the fire still burning at the altar behind us. The flames ate the ledger hungrily, but it was not enough to stop what was already awake. Riley led the way through the dense underbrush, his flashlight beams slicing through the unnatural darkness, barely holding back the encroaching shadows. George ran behind him, clutching the remaining gasoline flask, while I stumbled, breath ragged, trying to keep up. The air pulsed like a drumbeat inside my chest, the shepherd's heartbeat. Behind us, the pillar convulsed again, its monolithic form now shifting, warping as though something inside was trying to push through the impossible black surface. You feel it? George gasped between steps. It's bleeding. I didn't understand what that meant until I looked back. The base of the pillar cracked open like splitting skin. From the wound, something massive moved inside, long appendages coiling and flexing, wrapped in glistening black muscle that seemed to drink in every flicker of light. The shepherd. It was no longer content being worshipped from afar. Riley shouted over his shoulder, "Move! We have to reach the car!" But the forest had other plans. Ahead of us, several of the faceless creatures dropped from the trees, blocking the narrow path. Their heads twitched violently as they tilted toward us, their arms unnaturally long, their skin shimmering like wet plastic. Riley didn't hesitate. He fired his shotgun, the blast shredding one creature's chest open in a spray of black ichor. It stumbled backward but didn't fall. They no longer cared about pain. More of them emerged, surrounding us, cutting off every direction. We're boxed in, George shouted. The shepherd's children stood in a perfect ring around us, silent now, watching. Then the humming changed pitch again. It wasn't just vibrating anymore. It was speaking, not in words, but in thoughts, images, memories. And suddenly I saw it all. The founders kneeling before the pillar, the first sacrifices. My father standing at this very altar decades ago, holding me as an infant while the council argued behind him. He had tried to break the pact, but in doing so he had marked me instead. I was never supposed to survive that night, but something or someone had interfered. You were spared. A voice whispered directly into my mind. The voice wasn't my own. It wasn't my father's. It was the shepherd itself. You carry the vessel within you, Robert Mercer. My knees buckled. The world spun. Riley caught my arm, pulling me upright. Don't listen to it, he barked, but it was everywhere. Inside my bones, my blood. The shepherd continued. You burned their offering. You defied the pact. But you are still mine. I screamed, clutching my head, trying to drown it out. The tendrils in the distance writhed like serpents, slowly snaking their way toward us. Fight it, Robert, George shouted. It only has power if you let it. but I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred. The pillar grew larger in my mind, filling every thought. The forest disappeared. The sky vanished. There was only the shepherd. And then, a gunshot rang out. The noise snapped me back into my body. George stood nearby, barrel smoking, one of the creatures now lying motionless at his feet. Riley grabbed my face. His eyes were bloodshot, desperate. "Robert, you control whether you become its vessel, not it." I tried to steady my breath, anchoring myself in his voice. The shepherd hissed in my skull. "Your father chose defiance. He failed. You will too." "No," I whispered. "I won't." From behind us, the tendrils lunged forward, slicing through the air like black whips. George emptied the last of the gasoline into a wide arc and ignited it. The flames roared, cutting off the tendrils just long enough for us to push through a small gap. We ran again, tripping over roots, lungs burning, the shepherd's voice chasing us every step. "You belong to me." I bit down on my own tongue until I tasted blood, forcing myself to block the invasive thoughts. Ahead I saw it, the service road. The car was still there, headlights faintly glowing like beacons in the thickening fog. We threw ourselves inside. Riley started the engine as George climbed into the back seat, still gripping his weapon with white knuckles. The tires spun violently on the soft dirt before finally catching. We sped down the road, the pillars shrinking behind us, but the humming never fading. Even as distance grew, I knew we hadn't destroyed it. Not completely. We had only delayed it. The council would not stop, and neither would the shepherd. We reached the outskirts of Tenebrous Hollow as dawn tried and failed to break through the churning sky. The storm above us didn't move like any weather system. It swirled unnaturally, thick clouds pulsing faintly with the same rhythm we'd heard inside the woods, as though the shepherd's breath now filled the air itself. The town was empty. Porch lights flickered, doors left half open. Abandoned cars sat in the middle of streets. Windows were either boarded up or smashed in. The few residents who hadn't fled were likely hiding deep inside their homes, clinging to the fragile safety of flickering bulbs, praying they could survive one more night. "They know," Riley said quietly. "They feel it too." "They know it's coming," George added, "and they know we failed." The car rolled slowly down Main Street. The silence was suffocating. Even in its most cursed state, Tenebrous Hollow had never been this still. We turned onto Milford Avenue, toward the police station, the only building still fully lit, and waiting for us on the front steps were the men in black, the council. The same pair who'd confronted us days earlier now stood alongside three others, all wearing the same tailored dark suits, faces pale beneath the swirling sky. The lead man, the one who'd smiled coldly when we first met, stepped forward as Riley brought the car to a stop. Before he could speak, I opened the door and got out. My body still shook from the shepherd's voice, but I forced myself to stand tall. "You knew this was going to happen," I said. "You always knew." His smile barely twitched. "Mr. Mercer, welcome back. You called me the vessel." My voice wavered but held. "You knew I was marked since I was a child." "Of course." The man's tone was calm, almost fatherly. "You were born into this. Your bloodline has always belonged to the Hollow." George stepped forward beside me. "The ledger is gone," he snapped. "The pact is broken. You've lost control." At that, the councilmen exchanged glances, not of fear, but calculation. "The shepherd cannot be contained by simple paper, Mr. Dorsey," the leader said softly. "The pact was always symbolic. What matters is the intention behind it." Riley's voice cut in, sharp and low. "You're stalling." The man's eyes flicked toward him. "On the contrary, Sheriff, we are preparing." "Preparing for what?" I demanded. "For your final surrender." Behind them, the sky cracked open. It wasn't lightning. It was something far worse. A spiraling vortex tore open above the woods, as though the clouds themselves were being sucked into an invisible drain. From the center, black tendrils stretched outward like fingers groping for purchase. The shepherd had finally crossed into our world. It no longer requires ceremony, the council leader continued. The vessel has matured. The threshold is open. I felt my vision narrow, my breathing grow shallow. The pull inside my chest returned. Stronger, more intimate. Like hooks buried deep inside my ribs were being tugged toward the vortex. George stepped between me and the council. You won't take him. You can't stop what's already begun, the man said gently, as though comforting a child. But you can choose to make it painless. Why? I whispered. Why not just take anyone? Why me? The man tilted his head slightly. Because your father defied us. He created imbalance. You, Robert, are both the key and the correction. Your death would destabilize the shepherd, but your acceptance will complete its crossing. Riley chambered around in his shotgun. Then we're not letting him accept anything. The man's smile finally faded. You misunderstand. It no longer requires permission. As if on cue, the humming intensified again, but now it wasn't just in my head. The air itself vibrated. The ground beneath our feet trembled. The entire town shuddered as a deep, low moan emanated from the woods behind us, growing louder, rolling through the empty streets like a shockwave. And then they came. The faceless ones poured into the town like a black flood. Hundreds, thousands, crawling over rooftops, spilling into alleyways, filling the streets with their grotesque jerking motions. The council stood perfectly still as the creatures swarmed around them, forming a protective wall of bodies. George grabbed my arm. We have to move. We bolted for the police station's entrance. Riley fired twice into the mob, clearing a narrow path. The faceless ones shrieked but recoiled under the blast. Inside, the building was eerily intact. The lights flickered but held steady. George slammed the door behind us, bolting every lock. Riley moved to the supply closet, pulling out extra shells, radios, and emergency lights. This won't hold forever, he said breathlessly, but it might buy us time. Outside, the street was no longer visible, only a sea of shifting, writhing black forms. I stumbled toward Riley's desk, gripping the edge for balance as waves of nausea rolled through me again. The shepherd's voice pressed harder inside my skull now. You cannot run. You are always mine. My head pounded, vision splitting. The world pulsed between real and unreal, as though the entire town hung on the edge of two realities crashing together. And then, amidst the swirling distortion, I saw something I hadn't expected. My father, standing outside the station window, pale, hollow-eyed, but unmistakably him. He mouthed something silently. End it. Before I could react, Riley shouted from across the room. They're breaching the side entrance. The locks rattled violently, metal groaning under the weight of dozens of limbs slamming into it. George handed me a flare gun. Robert, this ends tonight. One way or another, the shepherd's pull grew unbearable, and the storm outside deepened. The side entrance gave way with a metallic shriek, and the first wave of creatures poured into the hallway like liquid shadow. Riley fired, the deafening blast ripping through two of them, black ichor spraying across the walls. But for every one that fell, three more clawed forward, limbs jerking in that unnatural, puppet-like rhythm. George flung open the weapons locker, tossing me extra shells. Keep them back, he shouted. We held the line as best we could, but the shepherd's children were endless. They didn't hesitate. They didn't scream. They simply advanced. Silent vessels drawn to the pulsing signal vibrating inside my skull. You are mine, the shepherd whispered again. The door is open. All that remains is your surrender. My legs trembled under the weight of its presence, but some part of me still resisted. Anchored by Riley's voice, George's steady hand, and the flickering image of my father mouthing, "End it." But how? A sudden crack split the air as lightning, not of this world, struck somewhere outside, sending a shockwave through the entire building. The windows shattered. The overhead lights finally flickered and died. Darkness swallowed the station. In that moment, the creatures froze. Their featureless faces all turned toward me at once, and I finally understood. It wasn't just feeding on fear. It fed on identity, on self, on bloodlines, on unfinished cycles. The shepherd hadn't chosen me randomly. It needed me. My lineage was the vessel that would make its transition permanent, and it had waited decades for this. The council's true plan wasn't to control the shepherd. It was to complete its birth through me. I stumbled backward, clutching my head. I see you now. The shepherd answered in a voice deeper than thought. Then embrace me. George grabbed my shoulder, forcing my gaze up. Don't listen, Robert. Focus. I swallowed the bile in my throat. We have to sever it. Riley glanced at me, panting. How? Not destroy it. Sever it from me. My words came out hoarse but certain. It's using the bond, the bloodline, that's the tether. George's eyes widened in realization. The fire wasn't enough because it was symbolic. We have to break the tether itself. From behind us, the councilman emerged into the shattered lobby. The creatures parted for them like obedient hounds. The lead man, his expression still perfectly calm, raised his hand. It is over, Mr. Mercer, he said softly. You feel it too. You belong to the shepherd. Your fight only delays the inevitable. I lifted the flare gun, hand shaking. No, I rasped. It ends now. The councilman stepped forward, his voice nearly affectionate. You cannot run from your nature. Riley chambered another round. Step back, or I swear, but before he could finish, the councilman spoke again, directly to me, or rather, through me. You are not fighting me. You are fighting yourself. The pulse inside my skull reached its peak, like a splitting migraine erupting through my entire nervous system. I collapsed to my knees, vision narrowing, heart pounding. End it. The echo of my father's voice cut through the storm of thoughts. I forced my eyes open, fixing on Riley and George. Cut me loose. Riley's face paled. Robert, do it, I screamed. If you don't, it wins. George pulled a long hunting knife from his belt, his hands trembling. You sure? He whispered. I nodded once. Without hesitation, he sliced across my palm, deep and fast. The blood poured freely onto the station's floor, but it wasn't normal blood. It moved. The black strands inside twisted upward like smoke, writhing, fighting to hold onto my flesh even as it spilled away. The shepherd howled inside my mind, its voice distorting into pure rage. No! The creatures convulsed violently, some collapsing into heaps of decaying tissue, others dissolving into mist. The vortex outside shrieked as the tether between us began to fracture. The councilman stepped backward now for the first time, his mask of control slipping. You don't know what you're doing, he shouted. You'll destroy everything. I gritted my teeth, pressing my bleeding hand to the ground, forcing more of the infection out. That's the idea. The storm above the town cracked open wider and then began to collapse inward. The shepherd's tendrils thrashed wildly through the air, but they no longer reached for me. They flailed as though lost, disconnected. The building shook as one final pulse of energy rippled outward, flattening the remaining creatures in a blast of pure sound. Then, silence. The sky above cleared almost instantly, leaving only thin gray clouds drifting lazily in their place. The councilmen stood frozen, their faces drained of color. Without the shepherd's power, they were nothing but frightened old men in expensive suits. George lowered his knife, panting. Riley dropped his weapon entirely, slumping against the wall. I knelt there, my hand still bleeding, but the weight inside my mind was finally, mercifully, gone. The shepherd was severed. Not dead, but trapped once again, and I was no longer its vassal. The councilman staggered forward, his voice cracking now, desperate. This isn't over. Riley cut him off. Oh yes, it is. Sirens in the distance announced the arrival of state police units. Finally responding, too late, as always. I looked at George, at Riley, and finally out at the clearing sky beyond. We'd survived, but as I stared into the morning light, I knew the truth. The shepherd was still out there, waiting, watching, and one day, someone else would open the door again. And that was the Shepherd of Tenebrous Hollow, a story of forgotten pacts, haunted bloodlines, and the price of unraveling truths better left buried. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows. Sometimes, the true horror isn't the monster itself, but the echoes it leaves behind in those who dare to face it. As always, if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more chilling stories, where reality twists, rules break, and the darkness whispers from just beyond the veil. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and above all, never break the rules.